All right, share my screen again. So we left off with ADA. 1993, the Family Medical Leave Act. This was signed into law under President Clinton at the time, and it requires employers of a certain size, I think the cutoff is 50, to grant an eligible employee up to a total of 12 work weeks of unpaid leave during any 12-month period. So it didn't require employers to provide paid leave, but at least you've got your job. If you need to do something for a sick parent, a sick child, or go through some other situation, a newborn child, an adoption, there are a number of things that you might have to deal with in your own personal family life. And the law now requires that you can come back to your job, or at least an equivalent job, after you leave. They can't fire you or in any way discriminate against you because of that leave. And as great as that sounds, well, who can afford to do that? Some people can, some people can't. Some people have a spouse or other family members can pick up the slack while you're taking leave, but it's a drop in the bucket, but at least it's a move in the right direction. I would say that a lot of people in other countries laugh at the United States about our constant use of the phrase family values, yet we won't provide health coverage, we won't provide paid leave. The amount of vacations that we allow families are pretty limited compared to most European countries. Now, one of the things, just a little aside, when this first happened in '93, there were a lot of companies that started to do something that is illegal, but they would take employees and switch them over to contractor status. You're no longer my employee. You are an independent contractor. What does that do? That might get their number of employees down below 50, I think it is. So now they no longer have to comply with the Family Medical Leave Act. So if a company had 60 employees and they could squeeze 12 of them off the books, now they don't have to comply. Or they don't have to provide a lot of benefits by making somebody a contractor. You either are or aren't a contractor, and making somebody who technically is an employee, somebody who works for you, must follow your hours, your duties, is under your control. They're an employee entitled to all employee benefits and protections. They're not an independent contractor. But there was a bunch of companies across the country that started to do this as soon as the Family Medical Leave Act was put into law, because they didn't want to have to deal with it. I think it's a shame. I think we should automatically have paid leave for adoptions and births, and if somebody's sick. I mean, I don't think we are truly a country of family values, certainly not in terms of our business and labor law. 2004 took quite a while to fill in some of the gaps on what we wanted to see in California. We have the California's paid family leave law. And so that is a reduced pay situation. If you are in a company as an employee under the state disability insurance program, you can get a maximum of 6 weeks of partial pay time off of work for very similar situations as the Family and Medical Leave Act. So how does this all work? You've got disability insurance, you've got paid family leave, you've got unpaid family and medical leave at the federal level, it can be a nightmare to try and figure out, how do I deal with all of this? A lot of good companies have something called a human resources department with a specialist who is there for employee rights. Now, any larger company has a human resources department, and even the smaller ones might have a human resources department, or at least one or two people to run human resources activities. But in a good company, the human resources specialist will help you navigate this and line up things where you can do a combination of paid and unpaid leaves in order to maximize your ability to get the benefits that you are entitled to. But it can be very, very difficult to negotiate if your company doesn't have somebody who's willing to help you navigate these kinds of things in the event of birth of a child, an adoption, a sick family member. There are also other labor organizations and law firms that focus on helping employees, and not just ag employees, but any employees. So anyway, in 2016, just 5 years ago, roughly, California approves AB 1066, authorizing all workers, including ag workers, to receive overtime pay for all work after 8 hours. I would think most of you have heard about this. This is a big, big deal. It was phased in over the last several years. It became fully phased in, I believe it was January 1st of 2020. And in agriculture, that a lot of people were freaking out, but it's something you have to deal with. It doesn't impact union employees, because union employees have a union contract negotiated between the employee group and the company. And so if you're under a contract, you can set up your hours anyway within limits. You know, you can't do 23-hour shifts in agriculture, certainly. You can do longer shifts, like there are 24-hour shifts in law enforcement and fire and things like that, because you need to. You know, an active event, an active fire, you know, I've worked a lot of 24-hour shifts when I was a firefighter back in the day. And that's just what you have to do, because that's the requirements of the job. But in agriculture, in a lot of other things that are non-union, 8 hours, period. And if you are union, even though you don't have to comply with the 8-hour rule, there are lots of other ways to make sure that employees get fair compensation and working conditions. Now, with a union, you could do 410s to get your 40 hours. And a lot of people love that. I've got some friends that just love working for a organization that has 410s. So you work 10 hours a day, Monday through Thursday, and now you got a 3-day weekend every week. Yay. Now in agriculture, you're probably working a lot of 50-hour, if not 60-hour weeks. That's kind of normal, especially if you're a farm manager. 60 hours is just what you do. You're there ready to roll at 6, and you're there till the sun goes down on most days. And that's life. That, you know, you need to know what your situation is. And at least if you're not covered by a union, 8 hours is the maximum before overtime kicks in, with some exceptions, as you might expect. So in federal law, the labor law is administered primarily by the Department of Labor, but labor is extremely comprehensive and complicated. And so there are lots of other regulatory agencies besides the Department of Labor that get involved in labor laws. So for example, OSHA, which I've already mentioned, it deals with safety, but is that overlapping with labor issues? Oh, definitely. subject to the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as state laws. That's how they determine wages. And in states, you can either follow federal law, or if you're going to do something different, it has to be the same or higher than federal law. So there's minimum wages, which is, I would argue, a global embarrassment. You can see how over many, many decades, wages have changed from one level to the next. But at the federal level, there hasn't been any movement in the minimum wage since 2009. Has there been any increase in costs? Has there been inflation since 2009? Yeah, I would say that 725 is an embarrassment. If federal minimum wages kept pace with inflation, we'd be somewhere between $17 and $20 an hour, depending on how you looked at it. I understand some of the arguments that, you know, there needs to be minimum wage for training jobs and for entry-level situations, but there are people that work minimum wage for years, and they're not an entry level. Fine, if you have some sort of a short-term internship, if you have you know, job training period for the first 3 months, you're a high school student doing some work studies type situation, I can understand the argument to have a lower wage. But if you're an experienced adult worker who's not in part of their training, this idea that 725 an hour, even in the most backwater section of Louisiana, or the lowest wage states in the country, probably would be Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, places that have these wages. 725 an hour isn't enough. It doesn't make any sense. You cannot afford anything with that. So that's the federal minimum wage. The floor is pretty damn low at the federal level. At the state level, California's state minimum is $11 an hour, $10.50 for smaller companies. I believe some areas are $13 an hour. I don't think there's been any movement here. I think this is the industrial relations. This must be current. San Francisco, I think, is $15 an hour. So depending on where you are, because of local conditions, you can raise it. You just can't push it down. Federal minimum wage and overtime pay does not require severance pay. Severance pay is money that you get after you leave a company. So when you are laid off, a lot of times in higher level positions, the company will give you a couple weeks or a month of pay for work that you didn't do, to give you some money to survive till you get that next job. That's called severance pay. There's no requirement. That is used as a reward to some employees. Unfortunately, it's usually only the higher level employees that get this, what we call the exempt employees, which I'll get to in a minute. But it's not everybody, and it can be used as a recruiting tool. You're trying to get employees to come work for your company. Well, if you've got a good reputation for providing benefits and severance pay and sick leave and vacations and holidays, all of these things that are not mandated or required under law, it can help attract employees come to your company. For agricultural operations, it prohibits the employment of children under the age of 16 during school hours and in certain jobs deemed too dangerous. And in agriculture, pretty much everything outside is deemed too dangerous. So unless you're in the front office working with the payroll folks or something like that, if you're in a warehouse or you're in the field, it's too dangerous. And so the only time you see people working in ag under the age of 16 is usually when it's on the family farm. You're the child of somebody who owns the farm. And then the rules are a little different for working on a family farm. So there's a narrow gap, 16 to 18, that 2-year window where it's much easier to get employees that are in that age group and not only hiring them, getting them on your insurance and finding work for them. Even though it's easier, it's still not easy enough. Having a worker in agriculture who's between the ages of 16 and 18, for a lot of companies, it's not worth it. And I know several companies that they won't do it. It's just not worth it. They will only hire 18 and older just to avoid the insurance premium. You pay more for having underage workers and all of the other liability issues of having an underage worker. So you can, it's just a little tricky unless you're on your own family farm. Next, we come to the word exempt. I mentioned that a moment ago. To be exempt from minimum wage and overtime pay requirements, you must meet certain requirements. So when we say an exempt employee, we're talking about exemption from minimum wage and overtime. Now, the exempt from minimum wage really isn't relevant in the vast majority of cases because the people who qualify as exempt employees, with very few exceptions, make more than minimum wage by a lot. So these are executives, administrative positions, professional employees, sales employees, certain skilled computer professionals. In sales, sometimes you get commission. You don't get paid anything. You either sell or you don't, and you get a percentage off of your sale. That is legal. But you have to be careful how you set that up because there are ways that can be deemed illegal for that. So if you are in a position of higher responsibility, then you can get in exempt status. The good thing, you're making more money. Your salary, you don't have to worry about keeping track of your hours. And so a lot of people hear exempt employee and they're like, what's that? Salaried employee. Oh, I know what that is. You get a fixed amount every week or every month, regardless of how many hours you put in. Problem is, regardless of how many hours you put in, because most exempt employees that I know don't work 40 hours and go home. Some do, yay for you. I wish I was in that spot. They work overtime and they don't get a cent. Whether you work 40, 50, 30, 100 hours a week, that is killer. Does it happen? Oh yeah. I spent 2 months doing 100 hours a week, 8 weeks straight, and it damn near killed me. But not literally, but I was dead to the world. And then when things slowed down, I was only doing 75. Was I being taken advantage of by the company? Yeah. Was there much I could do about it? Not really. Was I my own worst enemy, part of the problem? No doubt. I let it happen to a certain extent, but got past the hurdle and moved on. So who else would be exempt? Fishing operations. I think that's pretty easy to understand. You're out in the ocean on a fishing boat. You can't be clocking the hours. That it doesn't make sense. What about farm workers on small farms? So you've got really small companies, less than 500, what they call man days or worker days, to be more politically correct and modern terminology. In a calendar quarter, if you have less than 500 days work in 3 months, you're a pretty dang small company. So you might be able to squeeze in on an exemption for overtime in that category. You still, in that category, would have to comply with minimum. Exempt from overtime pay only, but not minimum wage. Auto, truck, and farm implement salespersons, parts clerks, mechanics, non-manufacturing, or excuse me, mechanics, farm workers, right there. Farm workers are exempt from overtime pay in the federal eyes. In California, we get overtime pay after 8 hours now, unless it's governed by a union. Remember, you got to keep these federal versus state issues separate. I won't try and trick you on any test, but you do have to keep that in the back of your mind. At the federal level, farm workers are exempt from overtime. But there still are rules. You can't say, oh, you're exempt from overtime, so I'm going to work you 14-hour days. No, that doesn't work. Doesn't fly. Minimum wage, we already looked at that. Been $7.25 an hour since 2009. There is something called piece rate. Maybe you've heard of it. Instead of paying an employee so many dollars an hour, you pay them for so much piece of work. Maybe so many cents per clamshell of strawberries you harvest and pack. Maybe so many cents per length of irrigation pipe you put in the field to irrigate or whatever. So the faster your crew is, the better you work, the more you get done, the more you get paid at the end of the day. But if you are on a piece rate type of position and things are not going well that day, you can never give the employee less than minimum wage at the end of the day. So if they put in an 8-hour day on piece rate, at the minimum, what you pay them has to be, if it's in a federally controlled area, $7.25 an hour. If it's in California, probably $11 an hour as a minimum. Now, one of the things that I did as an employer, occasionally we would have these bad fields in strawberries. There was a problem. We still need to harvest them, but the crew would never make their piece rate the same in these couple of fields that had problems. And because there were problems, they would be working the same number of hours, but they wouldn't get as many strawberries, as many flats of strawberries done in a day. So we increased the piece rate in those fields. We didn't say, well, you're still making minimum wage, be happy and go home. No, you're going to get unhappy workers and they're going to leave. And labor is really important, not only to be good to your employees, but to keep workers on your crew. And so the strawberry crew back in those days, we would make sure that we didn't pay them a piece rate that met minimum wage. We would pay them a piece rate that would match their normal piece rate. So, you know, just a round number. If they normally made $100 during a day and they were in a bad field that technically they only earned $80 that day because of the bad conditions, we bumped it up to 100. So they wouldn't go anywhere. And it was our problem. It was our fault that they had a couple of bad fields, not the workers' fault. Other labor laws, I'm not going to go through these. We've talked about some of them already, but there are lots of laws, many more than this, related to wage payments. Health and benefits. There are group health plans that are generally provided for employees that do get it. They can be provided by the employer or by a union. And the employer might purchase them through an organization like the Western Growers Association. That gives them better bargaining power. So you've got hundreds of small ag companies that all go together and buy their insurance through Western Growers Association. Now, Western Growers Association can turn around to the big insurance company, and instead of you as a small company trying to say, I want to buy insurance for 25 employees, Western Growers can turn around on your behalf and say, we want to negotiate a health contract for thousands of employees, get a better deal. The union, same thing. Union groups can provide health benefits for the employees within the union. ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. This provides minimum standards for pensions and health plans. So it's in this section because of the health plan portion. And it provides specific information about what a company must do in order to properly provide and fund a pension or a health plan for employees. So it meets standards. You must meet basic standards. If I'm going to provide a pension for employees, or even a 401k program, which is different rules, it's not ERISA, but if I'm going to provide something, I have to meet these minimum standards. If I'm going to provide a health insurance plan, I can't just say, look at us, we're providing health insurance, and it's basically a bottle of aspirin. That's all you get. That's your health insurance plan. You can't do that. If it's going to be called a health insurance plan, it has to meet certain standards. There have been numerous amendments to ERISA because it's changed over the years. It's very complicated in terms of insurance right now. And again, I would argue another international embarrassment. How the hell do we have such a massively successful and wealthy country that we don't provide health insurance for our citizens? And I don't care which side of the political spectrum you are, I think it's absurd. The idea that we can't afford to provide health insurance for as a standard basic right as an American citizen. It's a laughable lie. Of course we could. We just don't, and we don't for many different reasons. And so what are we stuck with? A very bizarre insurance problem, a quagmire of all of these different things where some people get great insurance, some people get crappy insurance, some people don't get any insurance at all. Some people think they have insurance that covers things and then they find out it doesn't. So over the years, there have been efforts to put little plugs in the hole of all of this. We've had the Affordable Care Act, which maybe you know better as Obamacare. And we have Covered California, which is our local California versions of options for Obamacare. But other things like ERISA have also been fixed, amended, tweaked to try to have something that gets a lot of people coverage. Unfortunately, we have millions that don't have coverage. COBRA, I never could remember, Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, but COBRA did something that I remember when I was changing from one job to the next. COBRA gave me a guaranteed right to purchase the same insurance, as long as I didn't let it lapse, the same insurance as I had with my employer. So I just notified my employer, I want to keep the insurance that I had with you, and I'm leaving. And there's a limit. I don't know how long you can keep it. It's only for a few months, but you can keep it. It was very expensive, but my wife at the time was pregnant, and we had to have health insurance. And so I paid this outrageous amount for 2 or 3 months till I got settled in, insured in another position. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act allows you to take insurance with you, so you have continued coverage when you change jobs. Again, it's very complicated, and it shouldn't be. Number one reason why Americans go bankrupt and end up on government assistance when they weren't before: health issues. They have a medical condition or something that wipes them out, wipes out their savings, takes their home, takes everything. It's not right. So I think I'll take a break there.